thanks for the invitation to speak tonight. I come from Aotearoa, which is New Zealand, which is on the other side of the world. But my ancestors came from over here, from Bornholm, which is technically part of Denmark, but I actually think it's more part of Sweden. It's much closer. So it's always nice to come back to where my ancestors came from and to reconnect with those roots. And like Sweden, like Denmark, New Zealand, we're a sailing nation. The ocean is really important to us. So I was very happy to see this initiative of protecting the oceans. It's so important because the oceans are the lungs of the world, as well as such an important ecosystem. So it's really important that we have projects like the one we just heard of. And congratulations for a fantastic project. So I'm also over here for Stockholm Plus 50, a really important event here because it's highlighting crises, environmental crises, which is so important. Oceans is one of them, climate is another, food supply is another. These are connected crises that we need to work on. But also over here we see another crisis which has erupted, which is the invasion of Ukraine and the erosion of this world order that was, in a sense, particularly in Europe, where there hadn't been war since the Second World War, a rules-based order. There's some real problems with that, a crisis. And so we've got some crises on the planet that we need to deal with. I'm going to sort of talk about pretty much this. Money. And the role that money plays, because money is part of the problem in the climate crisis, it's part of the problem in the peace and disarmament area, but it's also part of the solution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem and why money is a problem, how it can be part of the solution, and then a little bit of what we've done in New Zealand as an example, as a transition. So I mentioned money because we know about the climate crisis, we know about the oceans crisis, and yet there still is fossil fuel economy. There's still the production of materials that are going into the oceans. There's overfishing. A lot of that is stimulated by those who are making a lot of money from it. And they are resisting the change and they are putting pressure. So the fossil fuel industry is resisting the change we need to make to protect the climate. It's also true in the peace and disarmament area. We have at the moment the figures from SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the recent figures on the amount of money that's invested just by governments in militaries is €2 trillion per year, or $2.2 trillion. That's a lot of money. Now, if I had that in 10 euro notes, that is 200,000 million 10 euro notes. Now, that's a hard number to figure. It's a huge number. If I stacked them sort of from here and started stacking them up, the stack would keep going, it would keep going, it would keep going, all the way to the moon. That's 390,000 kilometres of 10 euro notes stacked. It's a phenomenal amount of money that's going into the military. Now, just compare that with how much is going into the United Nations. The annual budget of the United Nations, the core budget, is 6 billion. 6 billion is less than 1/300th. It's about less than 1 day of the military spending. Can you imagine 1 day of the military spending going on the United Nations, which is the forum that brings everyone together to address all these critical issues for humanity, and it has less than 1 day worth of the military budget. So that's a violation of priorities, and we need to shift those priorities. On the nuclear weapons issue, which I'm working on, it's $100 billion a year. So that's about one fifth of the total military budget. And that's the area that I've been working most on because it's one of the areas that's most easy for us to shift. Nuclear weapons, we know that they also are a threat to the planet, to future generations, that any use would be catastrophic. We can convince governments that they should not have these nuclear weapons. They are sticking to them at the moment, some of them. We've seen they've been threatened a little bit. Russia was threatening a bit over the Ukraine, but we can address these. One of the ways we can address it is, again, through the money. Why are we getting so many of these nuclear weapons still being produced? They've been modernised. why are governments spending so much? And one of the key reasons is because of the corporate power, particularly in the United States, particularly in France, particularly in the UK. Corporations, there are about 27 corporations, it's not a lot, in the world that are making nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. About 27. They make a huge amount of money, and they are influencing the policymakers. They are lobbying the US Congress members to vote for more nuclear weapons, for modernised nuclear weapons, for new types of nuclear weapons. So how can we address that? So we're trying with some of our Congress members, like Senator Markey is a co-president of our organisation. He has an act called the SANE Act, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure. Cut the nuclear expenditure, spend it on public health, spend it on climate issues, on renewable energy. Another one, the ICBM. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, but also stands for Invest in Cures Before Missiles. So he's put forward the ICBM Act to say we don't need new nuclear missiles. Let's put into a proper cure, for not just COVID-19 but future ones. But he can't get majority support because of the lobbying of the corporations. So we can help from the rest of the world because these corporations, they're on the stock market. People are investing in them. Private investors, banks, universities, religious organisations, sovereign wealth funds of governments, and many of us are involved in those. Most of us have a bank account, so we can actually check, is our bank investing in these nuclear weapons? If they are, we can have an appointment with one of the account managers and say, I'm going to take my account somewhere else unless you stop investing in nuclear weapons. You can do that with your city, sovereign wealth funds. Already we've got 4 governments, and New Zealand is one of them, that have decided they will no longer invest public funds in the nuclear weapons industry. New Zealand, Switzerland, Liechtenstein and Norway. So a movement is happening of divestment. And these movements can be powerful. It was the divestment movement against South Africa which really convinced South Africa to change. President de Klerk, basically once that the divestment movement got really up and running, particularly from the United States, but the rest of the world, President de Klerk went to his cabinet and said, we have to change. We're going to be in real problems economically. So the divestment movement can work, and in that, our divestment movement, which we're running to divest from nuclear weapons, and we're also getting universities to do it, and cities, is cooperating with the fossil fuel divestment campaign. So we're making connections between the fossil fuel and shifting to a green economy and shifting away from nuclear weapons. And when we are looking at the money, it's not just on the renewable energies, but also shifting the priorities for peace. So the last example I give, and then I'll wrap up, is from my government used to be part of a nuclear alliance. We used to allow nuclear weapons out our ports. We supported nuclear tests. We shifted the government through public pressure to reject the nuclear weapons and to support instead common security ways of resolving conflicts. We still had conflicts. We had a dispute with France. They blew up our peace boat in our harbour. But we didn't attack France after they blew up the Rainbow Warrior, the green peace boat. What we did is we went to the United Nations. They have a mediation service. And we mediated and we came to a conclusion which resolved the problem, and we're now good friends with France again. Similarly, another time with France, we had another problem with France. They were testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific. So we took them to the International Court of Justice. And we basically got France to stop nuclear testing in the Pacific through the court case. These common security mechanisms, the International Court of Justice, the UN mediation, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, we can put not just financial support into them, but also political support, call on our leaders to use them and help resolve these conflicts. Even with aggressive states, we can use these common security mechanisms to resolve these problems and build a much more peaceful planet that will be secure for our future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Alyn. Any questions from the audience? Oh, come on.
A million questions, I guess.
Yes, we had one here. Then you can.
So like how can we implement this initiative in autocratic countries like Turkey, Russia, where there is no single rule, like a constitution-based rule?
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned two things, money and common security mechanisms. The money one, it's easier to implement this in countries like the United States, like the UK, like France, where we're doing a lot of work on that. You're quite correct, in some of the autocratic countries, it's not the money that's doing it. So while there are two key companies that were calling on divestment from Russian companies that are involved in the nuclear weapons industry, and another 3 Russian companies that are involved in making tanks and other things which were calling on divestment for, that's not going to change Putin's mind.
Yep.
You know. What I think, though, is really important are the common security mechanisms that are being brought into play with this Ukraine conflict. So one of those is the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is where you have personal responsibility. Like a leader cannot get away from a decision by saying, well, it was our country. And so we've seen, for example, the International Criminal Court, that the former leaders of Serbia were taken, Karadzic from the military leader, Milosevic, the political leader, were taken to the International Criminal Court because of the war crimes that they were conducting. And that was a very important process that helped change the politics in Serbia and bring them back into the fold of better countries. So we've got there's a current investigation by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on the war crimes in Ukraine. This will take some time. They're gathering evidence, and the Ukrainians are helping with the evidence of the war crimes. But at some stage, that will elevate it up the procedure, and charges will be laid, I expect, against President Putin for war crimes in the Ukraine. There's also a similar case, a similar process that's happening in the International Court of Justice. This is on under the Genocide Convention. Putin argued that the military operation in Ukraine was necessary because Ukraine was conducting genocide in the Donbas region, and Russia needed to go in to prevent genocide. So there's two things about that. One, it was a lie. But two, even if it was true, that's not a justification for an armed attack. There is a procedure under the Genocide Convention that if you suspect, or you accuse someone else of conducting genocide, you can take them to the International Court of Justice. So that's what Ukraine has done. They lodged a case in the International Court of Justice against Russia, to firstly disprove. So Ukraine is up front. We didn't conduct genocide. We're up in front in the court. We'll present evidence. Russia will have to present evidence. But it also, what that case will do is it'll reaffirm that what Russia has done is an illegal act of aggression. So it'll help other cases. So these are common security mechanisms that I think are really important to continue, that give some hope that there may be some change, not immediately. We know in Serbia it didn't happen immediately, but it gives us some hope that there might be change. And we might emerge from this with a better Russia, without Putin, using some of these common security mechanisms.
We had one more question.
Actually, it was the same question.
Was it?
Any other questions?
So, the next question is the United Nations structure, the United Nations Security Council. So there are 5 permanent seats, right? So every time there is voting, Russia didn't vote, and so how can we change this? Because if we are introducing this mechanism as you are telling, so every time Russia, who is holding the permanent seat in UN, so how are you again going to change this then?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question. Veto power.
Yeah, so on many of these issues, it's not possible to get action or positive action from the Security Council because, as you say, the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council are China, France, UK, Russia, and the United States, and they have veto power. So then if you want to get something done by the United Nations, you go to one of the other bodies. So with the Ukraine issue, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they couldn't get a resolution from the Security Council saying that this was a violation of the UN Charter. So they went to the General Assembly instead. and got a resolution from the UN General Assembly saying that the invasion was a violation of the UN Charter. So there are other bodies you can go to. I also mentioned the International Court of Justice. That's another of the UN bodies that you can go to. There's the Human Rights Council, and we're doing work in the Human Rights Council at the moment because the Human Rights Committee has affirmed that both climate change and the threat or use of nuclear weapons is a violation of human rights, including the rights of future generations. So we can now challenge governments in the Human Rights Council on their obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which every government in the world is a member to, on those actions. So there are many different ways, and you have to be creative. As I said, when we had the dispute with France over the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, we couldn't get the Security Council resolution, but we got the mediation service of the Secretary General. And there are many times that the United Nations has actually worked behind the scenes to mediate conflicts and come to solutions, but you often don't hear about it because peace doesn't make the big news. The media don't really play, when there was a peace agreement that either avoided a war. They play more the conflict. So it's up to us to educate each other, ourselves, to learn about the positive solutions that happen. The UN, there's many of them from the UN. Right Livelihood is honouring many positive solutions that come from civil society, as is the World Future Council with the Future Policies Award. So we need to educate. And that's another important thing. In New Zealand, one of the other ways that we helped change the government was because we had peace education introduced into the curriculum so that children were learning about how you resolve conflicts peacefully and practicing that, conflicts with their brothers and sisters, with schoolmates, with teachers, with parents. And when they found out, you can resolve these conflicts peacefully, they had much more confidence that it's also possible for countries to solve their problems peacefully. And so it made for a population that's now totally behind our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who is always taking a peaceful approach, a conciliatory approach, and we have a population behind it because we've got a strong peace education in the schools. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyn. And here you go, a little small gift from us at TEDxStockholm.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's thank Alyn again.
Thank you.